Hey everybody, Kelly Justice here at Philosophy Society. It is June 19th. It's a Wednesday, 2024. We're in the Toronto Metropolitan University Library, room 861 today, same as last time. The structure of the room is better. You can see the board and so there's no like pillar in the way. So today we're going to go through we're going to finish the existence of God discussion. The other one got edited and posted, so we're going to deal with some YouTube stuff later so you guys can review it if you want. But before, we were kind of just talking about this gender identity thing, postmodernism and Deleuze. And you brought up boyhood and manhood, right? So, yeah, I feel like for me, I think objective reality exists. That's something that I'm going to firmly kind of hold on. And it's not based in faith. It's just based in epistemologically and psychologically, like how we know things in general, and then the properties of the believer or the thing that has the mind. And we can see minds that get depreciated. And so, and we could talk about Kant too, like about a perception and like how the self is always part of our perception. So we always have a sense of phenomena, but we don't really know what the noumena is. You can go down that road too if you want, but that's not, yeah, it's the thing that exists independent of you. The thing in itself,
like the spirit, I would say pneuma.
No,
Pneuma?
no, it's so I am perceiving the phone, and I know the phone through my perception.
Did you say pneuma though?
Noumena.
Oh, Newman. I thought said pneuma.
Or maybe I made a mistake.
Like the Tool song.
Yeah.
Pneuma.
And so yeah, objective reality, and then we've evolved an apparatus to detect properties in the cosmos, and then we use instruments to expand our like awareness of those properties in the cosmos, like the electromagnetic spectrum. And
why you call that a phone, not a tiger?
So the term used to designate the object can be different. Like there's different languages, for example, and there may be different utterances that a specific language would use. But the object, right, in physical space is not determined by us. It is, and that's what reality is. Reality is that which exists independent of all human belief. And sometimes our belief is proportional to reality. And you could say that that's like an approximation of truth. It's a correspondence theory of truth.
When someone identifies as something else, but not with a common identification for that item or that thing is, what is that called?
I would just say it's like, and there are some people that get very upset, like, and Ben Shapiro is I agree with Ben Shapiro in a lot of ways when he talks about gender identity and gender dysphoria. And, I disagree with him. It's interesting that he'll call people that are trans delusional, right? But then at the same time, he's very religious. And I would just say, well, Ben, are you not being delusional when it comes to being a Jew, or if you're a Christian or whatever, right? There's nothing wrong with being a Jew. Being a Jew is great. Go ahead, but your belief is based on faith. And again, I would just chalk it up as being delusional again. Yeah. And so gender identity, I talked about this before. I think the best way to think about it is humans have a fluid sense of gender in the sense that a man can be both feminine and masculine. And part of the problem comes when a man is overly feminine or feels feminine. They confuse their self as that thing, right? So it's like if you put on a costume as a ghost and you wore the costume for a long time and it became very familiar to you, and then you just thought you were a ghost. And then the easy test would be like, well, can you walk through the wall? And you can't, right? Yeah.
I had a similar, not theory, but way of explaining it. If a child were to grow up with gorillas in a forest, would the child not think he's a gorilla?
Yeah, that's
the environment.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
I guess until he looks at a mirror or something, but then.
And then that's where the dysphoria would come in, right? When reality kicks in, an overwhelming amount of like dissonance will be produced. And then the person just, and instead of accepting reality for what it is, there's this whole narrative that society has to change what we consider man, woman, masculine, feminine, or whatever, sexual orientation or sex, sorry. And it's not even, and even when they use the term assignment, like you were assigned this sex at birth. No, you weren't. You were born that way. Right?
Sex is different than gender, they say.
Yeah, sex is supposed to be biological, and then gender is like a psychological disposition in some ways. And when the psychological disposition doesn't match the biological state, that's when you get like people in transition or whatever. But it's just, like the stats on it is 40% of people that are trans also have autism, and a greater percentage suffer from some mental illness issue.
PTSD too, I've heard.
I don't know about PTSD. Like when you talk about that, well, yeah, that's its own thing. Like we'd have to talk about that.
The nature and nurture part.
Okay. Yeah, like they can have traumatic experiences as they get older. Just diagnostically, when people talk about PTSD, you've had to experience or witnessed a life-threatening situation, like being under a car or being assaulted or something like that. But I think that trauma is a larger term.
So I've got a question. You said that we are born. Yes, we are born with different, for example, different organs, sex organs. But that's a fact.
Yeah.
I think even the trans will recognize that. But because you are born with different organs, then you are called male or female. Is this a given, or is this also objective reality, or is it just like a society call you a male because you have that organ? So what? Where is objective? Where is it? What do you mean by you are born as a male? Is it because you are born with the for example with the organ, but the why you put the people in that male, the category called male?
Yeah, well, I think that the trans community would communicate, and they can correct me if I'm wrong, but they would communicate something like your gender is like what you experience or what you feel, right? And then man, or what you're called, also would be that gender. But it's like it doesn't really make sense, because if I look at somebody and they look like a woman, you could even be confused. Like there was one time I was serving, and there was a man who was trans that was dressed like a woman, and I thought it was a woman until I was like, wait a minute, you're not, and I think the way to remove the conceptual clarity is to talk about expression, right? And as human beings, a man can express themselves both masculine and in a feminine way, and a female can express herself in a masculine and or feminine way. And then you could argue that expression of masculinity and femininity is somewhat culturally determined. But I would also question whether there's certain evolutionary properties there too, that go beyond culture, right? It's even more ingrained and deep rooted.
When you say like the masculine and the feminine, it's like the animus and the anima. I don't remember who talked about that. You know who talked about that?
Recently? Oh, it sounds kind of Jungian. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it's like the male and the female force that we have in us, like the yin and the yang, for example. And like when you're at perfect balance, you're like equally as masculine as you are as feminine. They call it tender aggression. Where some people are too much on the masculine side, where they're just angry all the time. The parents that are the ones that hit their kids and are always flipping off. That's like too much on the masculine side, and then the ones that are too much on the feminine side, I guess, would be.
Well, I think we're going to get into confusing territory if we go down that road, It's more that like if there are certain norms in society and culture, and there's certain pro-social behaviors and then anti-social behaviors. So we talk about right and wrong. There's certain ways of treating each other that are not really good. And that's for all people, right? All humans. It's just part of human nature. Like alienating somebody is bad, whoever that is, right? Or in-group, out-group biases like racism and prejudice. That's not good, right? So, but the confusion comes when like you start stipulating that someone who's biologically a male is a female, and then you legislate it, and then now that person is in a major, like some of those people have been in prisons, and then they raped women in those prisons and got them pregnant. And so it just conceptually doesn't make sense to say, like, that's just a mistake of society now, right? Enabling this narrative and then allowing these circumstances to occur. and or men competing in women's sports. That's just not what it's for, right? I think there's something to be said about being respectful to people, but in some ways it's going too far when these types of cases start to emerge, right? Because they weren't necessarily prevalent before, right? And so I think it makes more sense to just talk about expression and how you're expressing yourself, and then just part of it is accepting what you are, and I think that when we look at the psychological predispositions that, like I said, 40% of individuals that are trans have autism, that has to be part of it. That's statistically significant, right? And so I would say that I think it would be fruitful to look at the socialization process that's been going on, and this is different than sexual orientation. Somebody's gay, right? There's nothing wrong with that, like that's like a preference that they have, that and they would still, thank you, they would still acknowledge their biological sex and their gender, right? And one of the criticisms we talked in in the human sexuality course I took last year was that the trans community is trying to destroy lesbians or gay people by saying that you're not actually gay, you're just in the wrong gender.
Who are they to say what they are?
Well, yeah, for sure.
Right.
But that they would say the same argument to everybody else against them. Who are you to say what I am?
Yeah.
Right. But that's part of what just delusional beliefs are. It's like when your beliefs don't match reality, that's like a problem. And it's not for the rest of the world even if the rest of the world, like if aliens came down, right, and did an evaluation of the species, like they would just be like, well, no, like you're a man. You just did all these surgeries to yourself. You just did your best to make yourself not look like that.
Biologically.
But
sorry, who's saying that?
so if an alien species came down and did dissected a bunch of humans and then had a trans person in there, they would say this human is just peculiar, right? Because they appear to be of the opposite sex, but they're not, right? And that's down to your chromosomes. So
would you say there's a different classification on the biological versus psychological side? That's basically.
Well, yeah, psychologically, the individual's identity or self-concept. And yourself, as we see in Buddhism, it's not, I wouldn't want to say that the self doesn't exist. It's just better to communicate it in such a way that the self is not a static entity. It's a dynamic entity that changes over time.
Good experience.
That's part of it. And there's certain properties, like the book I read was called Being No One by Thomas Meinsinger. And it's a challenging book. It's like a new version of Kant in some ways. Super intense. You'd like it. It's really cool. Yeah.
Being No One.
Yeah. And he talks about the subjective, a theory of personal subjectivity or first person experience. Anyways. Yeah. And so the self model can change. And some people's self models just may not be representative of what they really are, And that could be for example, if someone loses a limb and they're in a lot of dissonance or they're upset and they're grieving the loss of the limb, and that would suck, or as we age, and that's what almost a midlife crisis or a quarter life crisis could be, is that now you're not in your youth anymore and you have to catch up with the aging process. But it doesn't make sense to say that you're still in your early 20s if you're 50, right? It just doesn't make sense.
Most of those people get mentally stuck at an age due to trauma, I think. Is that a thing? That is a thing, right?
Yeah, it is, yes.
Is there anything for that?
When your chronological age doesn't match your biological age
It's
or developmental age.
Acquired brain injury, I guess.
Some people have it in that sense, yes, like FASD have that as a symptom, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So their age of maturity is different than their chronological age.
What about those who are more mature than
I
their
worked
age?
with a guy with FAS. Past.
I remember meeting someone like that too. But
Yeah, he was 32, but he acted like he was 15.
Yeah.
He was on the video games, he's so excited about everything all the time. He's really fun.
Such a wholesome thing, in a way.
Okay, let's put the train back on the tracks here. So let's do our presentation. We're going to finish this one on the existence of God. Okay, so last time we talked about Aquinas' 5 ways, and we looked at the arguments. And then what we did was we thought about why they don't make sense. And fundamentally, I can put it back this way. Probably see, if you sit right beside me, you can probably see it. Fundamentally, many of the arguments would be, even if there is a cause or a first cause, right? That is true. But to say that that first cause or whatever it is, the first motion, to say that it's necessarily the Christian God, you haven't proven that, right? That would be like saying the Big Bang is God, right? And even if it is, why does it have a moral code, right? Why does it tell you that you can do certain things and not do other things? That there's no connection there. Yeah.
There's one more thing, so because the causality, you're talking about the first cause, but the whole causality principle, will only apply in the experiences world. But you're talking about God.
Yeah.
God is not in the experiences world. You cannot experience God.
Yeah.
So how can you use a causality in a different category, which is not the efficient world? So
Yes.
so that's another thing.
That's Kant's argument
Yes,
against
exactly.
this stuff, right?
Okay.
But Aquinas didn't really think about that when he was writing it. But anyways, it doesn't matter. So let's go to the next spot. So this is Problems with Aquinas. So this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is a good reference for any philosophical idea. It's written by professors usually. There's the link there. So Kant held that the cosmological argument, in concluding the existence of an absolutely necessary being, attempts to prove the existence of a being whose non-existence is impossible and absolutely inconceivable. So this is the cosmological argument. So that you have to, it's necessary that if there is a cosmos, therefore there must be a God. And Kant indicates that what he has in mind by an absolutely necessary being is a being whose existence is logically necessary, where to deny the existence is contradictory. Okay. The ontological argument of the perfect being is determined to exist through its own concept. So this is the next argument we're going to go to. In fact, nothing can be determined to exist in this manner. One has to begin with existence. In short, the cosmological argument presupposes the cogency of the ontological argument. But since the ontological argument is defective for the above and other reasons, the cosmological argument depends or invokes it likewise must be defective.
I don't understand.
So he's saying that like the cosmological argument that existence is necessary because it's inconceivable or contradictory to think of a cosmos without a creator, for example, also is that argument is begging the question on a different argument, the ontological argument, which just basically means that the concept itself of God necessarily requires that God exists. So this is the next argument we'll get to, but cosmologically or ontologically, even thinking about God means God exists. The fact that you can have the thought of God means that it exists.
Why?
Yeah, exactly. We'll get to that next. There's a slide for it. But he's saying that if there is a problem with the ontological argument, then the cosmological argument is also flawed, because the cosmological argument depends on that conceptually, right? So let's go to the next one. So Anselm is another Christian theologian who was communicating about, so he has the ontological argument. So basically this is for the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is the other really good encyclopedia online that you can check out for philosophy stuff. So this is what Anselm is saying. It's a conceptual truth, or so to speak, true by definition, that God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. That is the greatest possible being that can be imagined. So when you think about God, what do you mean by that?
Can do everything.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's right.
Mhm.
That's what God's supposed to be.
Mhm.
The greatest thing.
Omnipotent.
We went through those attributes before, right? The attributes of God: all powerful, all knowing, all good, all present everywhere, and outside of time. Okay, so that's the first thing. It's the greatest thing that can be imagined is really what God is supposed to represent, right? At least in the Christian realm of thinking. God exists as an idea in the mind,
Mhm.
right? So this is the second premise.
Mhm.
Third premise, a being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is, other things being equal, greater than a being that exists as an idea in the mind only. So I can think about an elephant and then, or I can think about a pair of sunglasses and I can see sunglasses there. What is a greater thing? The sunglasses in mind and the sunglasses there. If it's only the sunglasses in mind, it's more, what do we mean by greater here? You know what I mean? Higher in quality or more robust, you could say, more real, right? And so he's saying, if God, we go back up to the first premise, is the thing that is the greatest thing you can think about,
Mhm.
then not only is it a thing to think about, but it is also a real thing.
Real thing you mean exist.
Yes. So he says, thus, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God. That is a greatest possible being that does exist. So if God was only in my mind, right? And let's say this alien came down and just had these, like Arnold Schwarzenegger biceps when he was in Commando. And he's like, I could do everything, you know, or like Dr. Manhattan from The Watchmen.
Yeah.
Right? Like just a super being. And that super being says to you, well, yeah, you guys have this idea of God, but have you ever seen it? No. It's like, well, I'm right here. And then he does a bunch of stuff. Or whatever. It does a bunch of stuff.
See, I would disagree with that because they say that God is beyond comprehension. And like you can understand, I guess, a part of God or the idea of God to a certain extent, but to understand God in its fullness, a great analogy that I thought of was that it's like explaining to a 2D Mario that only knows a 2D world what the third dimension is, like a 3D Mario.
Yeah.
Like how can you explain that to a 2D entity that a third, fourth, fifth, sixth dimension, whatever exists, without them actually experiencing it?
So the example that we talked about this last time was Flatland
Flatland?
from Carl Sagan.
I don't remember that.
So he draws this situation where, like, let's say you have a circle and a triangle,
Mhm.
and the triangle tells the circle, did you know that I calculated there's this thing called the sphere?
Mm.
Circle's like, well, what do you mean? It says, well, we live on a 2D plane and the sphere has the vertical plane, which means that it's an infinite amount of circles, but it's not at the same time. The circle's like, you're crazy. Doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And then sometime the sphere wants to interact with the 2D flatland world. But all that you would ever perceive is a dot, and then it would expand to a certain diameter, and then it would shrink down back to the dot as it passed itself through the 2D plane. Right?
Okay.
Mhm.
So I think that the problem is I kind of remember what Heidegger said, you know, because exist, I exist. You know, I may be strong, but strong is a thought to describe myself. But I exist. The existing is not something like a strong, like that. Existing is like a situation,
Like a state, right?
like a state.
Like a state.
A state is different.
Mm.
Somehow, you know, even before I know, like this phone exists. You know, exists is not like this phone is a square. This phone has lights. Exists is something design. You know, it's like
Being there.
being there.
Yeah.
Being there is not a strong. It's different.
It's not a
Different.
property.
Yeah, it's not a property.
Yeah, that's where Kant gets to that too. Existence is not a predicate. So existence is not a property.
So
of
what
a
is
thing.
exist?
Existence is a state of affairs,
What do you mean by state of affairs?
like being there,
Oh, being. Yeah.
right? And that's really the problem that we get fundamentally with any argument of God, is that it just conceptually kind of doesn't really make sense. And so God, if God was a thing, it's not even something to speak about, because language cannot capture it in any way. Which is kind of goes with what you're saying.
Mm.
And if that's true, then all religions are a waste of time, because you're doing something that never will ever get to what it is you're trying to do.
What is it you're trying to do?
What?
Understand God, know God, worship God. It's never ever going to be, it will never be a thing.
I think that's
Can you
the
slow
goal,
down here?
at least
You say all religion is Can you slow down here?
Yeah. So like, again, if God is beyond experience, beyond comprehension, and beyond language. All of religions are founded upon scripture, which is, or whether it's oral or written, and that scripture is language. And language is being used as a medium to know or understand God, or use God as a moral code that you would follow for your life. But if God is beyond language, and all religion is based on language, then we must do away with language and do away with scripture and all of standard religious practices, because you will never know. To truly love God is just to be you and forget about God, because you can't know it. And anytime you try to say that's what God is, you're wrong. You're wrong.
But what if they say, okay, I agree with you, but what if they say the language is like the map?
Mhm.
It's like the finger pointing to the moon. It's not the moon, but we still need the finger to point to the moon. What if they say that?
You don't actually need the finger, because any person on earth can see the moon. If God was real, then religion is not even necessary, like other things that are real, like gravity. You can explain gravity and test gravity because it is real, and then the main problem with religion and God is there is no testing. If it was real, then we would be able to develop a predictable method to understand and know it. But that isn't the case. The only way to know God is through some decaying cultural tradition that changes over time. It's never the same. If you're a Christian today and you went back 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, it's going to be different. There is no standardized way of practicing religion, right? It changes. And so it's just like the way I see religion, it's like an art form. It's like a dance. Some people have like their cultural dances, and religion is one of those things. But it's never going to get you closer to God. The only way to get close to God is to be fully human. And again, what do you mean by God? God is just the cosmos. If the cosmos was like a sphere, it's to the very limit of it. And that's all you can really know as a human. But it's beyond that, going with the property that God is beyond it. Anyways, let's go back to this.
Quick
Sorry, yes.
question. So besides of the argument of the existence of God or not,
Sure.
so don't you believe that having that faith and that belief gives you kind of like, I guess, an advantage in your day-to-day life?
Maybe you can make yourself feel better, but the
In
problem.
the sense that I'm sorry to cut you off. In
That's
the
fine.
sense I was thinking of it is every grand civilization has worshipped a higher deity, and has given them a grander or like a more immense sense of power over their competitors at the time. Like the Vikings with Valhalla, they would fight like crazy just from the idea alone. The Egyptians with their gods and whatnot, the Mayans and the Aztecs, like all these grand civilizations, they always believed in something grander, which is why I believe it made them so profound in history, because that's the only similar thing I believe within all those different civilizations is just worshiping something, regardless if it's real or not. I believe it gave them that mental strength and that energy, I guess, to do better than those around them.
Well, when you say do better, they were like killing each other and raping them and shit like that. So I don't know like how good they're really being to each other.
Well, like influential and like
Right, like-
existence-wise, compared to like the barbarians, I'd say that didn't believe in anything.
Again, it really hasn't taught people to be cooperative. And even if like you pick a specific religion, it doesn't, like some religions give the instructions to kill all non-believers, which is clearly antisocial, right? And so it's very unclear. Like even if you have this, there's other ways to achieve the same psychological result without having to give up your sense
of
reality.
Oh,
Like it comes at a cost. You're compartmentalizing your brain and saying, I allow magic to exist here, but everywhere else it doesn't.
Okay, so I know I maybe jump a little bit.
Okay.
So you probably noticed that several of this criticism about this proof is actually from Kant, right?
Sure.
But Kant actually brought back God, even though his version of God is different than those
Sure.
people.
Yeah.
His argument is like this. First of all, we have as a human being, right? We have rationality.
Mhm.
That's true, right?
Mhm.
Okay. And if we have rationality, then he through from this fact, he somehow he come up with this moral law.
Sure.
So moral law, like
Yeah.
I need to treat you like I treat everybody, like treat myself.
The
whatever,
categorical imperative.
the category, because this is what the requirement of rationality.
Yes.
Otherwise, logically, the rationality will induce this category imperative, right?
Yes.
So, and then also logically further, because the moral, you want to do good, then you will logically expect when you do good, you will have rewards. Otherwise, it's unlogical.
Yeah.
To do good and then you don't receive rewards.
Sure.
But you couldn't get rewards in your limited life,
Mhm.
in your this life. So logically, you have to have something, whether you call it God or whatever, afterlife, to satisfy that logical needs,
Mhm.
to give rewards for people to doing good. If you do good but no rewards, then logically it doesn't make any sense. So that's
Okay.
why from the morality, from the logical, from the rational, the nature of rationality, he brought back God.
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
What do you
I
think?
don't.
That's why.
I don't know if 100%, but I didn't go into Kant's justification because I was just like, whatever, Kant. But if that is an accurate rendition of his argument, it's still begging the question, like, God's existence isn't contingent on humans needing a reward to be good people, right? And it also contradicts the categorical imperative. Kant's moral ethics is based in a duty towards humanity in general. And if you don't act good to one human being, you're not acting good to humanity. And so the way you treat one person is representative of how you treat all people. And so he universalizes this, and that's fundamentally what the categorical imperative is based on, right? That's why it's categorical.
And he said because this is from the rationality itself. It's
Yeah.
a requirement of the rationality.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
basically, his moral rule is like 1 + 1 = 2.
Sure.
If you agree 1 + 1 = 2, then if you do the criticism, a critique of your rationality, you will come up with that in a category imperative.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
Kant is the one that's saying that the reason why people act good is to have that reward in the afterlife.
I don't know if that I don't know because I haven't looked into it, but
Because you said that's the only logical way someone will be good without a reward, right?
Yeah.
So I have a counterpoint to that, to Kant's belief. What if someone is good and expects no reward, but the reason why he does good is because he's been treated always bad, and he doesn't want others to feel that
Sure.
same feeling he had,
yeah.
from a sense of empathy.
Kant's not a consequentialist, right?
No.
So that
Not
it just seems
consequential.
contradictory to put the position because that's a very consequentialist. Address what you want to say now.
Okay, so it's just about Kant's categorical imperatives.
Yeah.
I was just confused. If you must treat one person the way you would treat everybody, and if you treat a person a certain way, you must treat everybody that way. How does it apply when it's a special scenario when you have to treat a person a special way? For example, if it's a criminal or it's somebody who cannot have control over their actions, how do you universalize that?
Yeah, that's a standard criticism of Kant. And when you study Kant in school, in various courses, you'll come to that criticism. There are papers written on that. One of the examples is like, don't lie, right? And you could say being honest is the best policy. But then we can think of circumstances where if you're honest, more harm will come because of your honesty. And my solution to that is that you just have to be more technical in how you develop your maxim. How you have your principle to action needs to include circumstances that account for, oops, I'm gonna have to go back here, that account for those particular cases. So, yeah.
My argument is that, this is a famous one because the why you cannot lie is not because of consequence, because the behavior of a lie
Yeah.
will self-destroy itself. Because if
Yeah.
everybody lie, because it's imperative, do something as universally can do. If you lie, then whether this lie is more or not, then just do a test. See if everybody lies.
Mm.
If everybody lies, then lie is not necessary.
Yeah.
Because you lie because somebody is still telling the truth. Then you can then there's a purpose of lying.
Mm.
So that's one argument. The other thing is, why is a harm? I think there's a differentiation here. For example, they use like how to say like a Nazi, come to your house,
Yeah.
and you hide a fugitive,
Well, the Jews, yeah, it's just if the Gestapo come to
Yeah.
your house,
Right.
like, are there any Jews in the house?
Right,
Do you tell them the truth
right,
or do you lie to them?
right.
Right?
Mm.
And if you have your buddies there and you're trying to protect him because he's Jewish in the fucking Holocaust,
Right.
and you tell the truth, they're going to take him away and do bad things to your friend.
Right.
Right? So
Yeah.
is it just or is it ethical
Right.
to lie to
Yeah.
the Nazi people?
Yeah.
And the argument we would just say is that that person doesn't have autonomy, the Gestapo person. And so because they don't have autonomy, you're not required to tell them the truth.
So it would only apply to people who are psychologically sane. Because like,
Yes.
or like people that aren't under the rule of someone that's psychologically.
The Nazi person doesn't have freedom because if they don't follow the rules, they'll be hurt
Correct.
or their family.
Mhm.
And they may lack competency or knowledge. They may not know why what they're doing is wrong.
Well, they're brainwashed in that sense.
And so those three properties are required for autonomy.
Mm.
Right?
So it's only okay to lie to those who are not clinically.
You know what? I wouldn't use the
not
word
clinically,
clinical.
sorry, yeah.
You have to kind of make it on a case by case situation.
I
Like
have this
extremes.
argument. A little different. So,
Hmm.
yes, I think that the action, what I would do is probably I would not tell the Gestapo.
Yeah.
But when I told this, I would not be like, oh, this is. I would still feel a pity, in the if it's not this extreme situation,
Mhm.
I shouldn't lie.
Mhm.
But if I lie to save the life, I won't feel like, oh, this is. I still feel pity, So Kant is talking about the moral feeling. So
No, that's more Hume.
Mhm.
Hume talks about sentiments.
Mhm.
Kant is just strictly like maxims and duty.
Mhm.
That's Kant. Okay, let's
yeah.
go back. Let's go back. It's okay. Let's just get through some of this, and then we'll
Sure.
continue. So okay, so the being in the mind and the being in reality, right? And so if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God because it does exist. It's the greatest possible being that does exist. That's why I gave the example of the alien that has superpowers. But we can't imagine something that is greater than God, for it's a contradiction to suppose that we can imagine a being greater than the greatest possible being that can be imagined. Therefore, God exists.
Like the argument that he has is not very sound. Excuse me. Just because you can't comprehend, since you can't imagine a being greater than the greatest possible being, therefore God exists. I don't know. It's weird.
Well, what about that example? I could imagine I have $1 million in my bank,
Mhm.
but that's different. That I actually have $1 million in the bank.
Mhm.
I think Kanye also used a similar.
I'm not sure,
examples.
but that's equivalent. It's more valuable to actually have $1 million than just imagine it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the ontological argument, and so Giuliano was another person that responded to this, and he talks about the perfect island example. So we're going to look at that next.
Yeah.
Right. So Anselm is within the concept itself. The proof is supposed to be in there, but in some ways, it's begging the question. Right? Like the premise is in the definition itself that it's trying to prove. So the ontological refutation would be, it's a conceptual truth that Pyland is an island in which none greater can be imagined. That is the greatest possible island that can be imagined. Pyland exists as an idea in the mind. Pyland that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is greater than Pyland that exists only as an idea in the mind. Thus, if Pyland exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine an island that's greater than Pyland, and the greatest possible island does exist. But we cannot imagine an island that's greater than Pyland, therefore Pyland exists. But it's not true.
So if you imagine X-rays without having an X-ray machine,
No, no. So the
Because his premise is basing it off like an island, off something that's tangible, something that you can see.
part of what's going on here.
So it already contradicts itself a little bit by using something physical, like an island.
Yeah,
in a way.
he's just showing that you can take the same form of reasoning and apply it to a different concept other than God and try to prove that that thing exists with this reasoning. And one of the properties is none greater that can be imagined, or the greatest possible X. And when you say that the none greater than can be imagined and greatest possible, and then you incorporate existence into there, that's when it becomes a problem.
Mm.
And that's where Kant's argument, which is the next one, would be that existence is not a predicate. It can't be a property of the thing. Yeah.
But there's a fallacy here.
Okay.
I think if I'm answering, I'm going to say, I'm talking about God.
Mhm.
You're talking about island.
Yeah.
An island is a limited things.
Mhm.
You cannot use the limited things to argue about God. God is not a limited things.
Mhm.
So it's two different categories.
Yeah, you could make that argument.
Or
Like,
something that you can perceive with the five senses, right? Like when you say something, what was the word you used? Yeah,
Experienced, concrete.
yeah, something that you can like observe or like experience through one of the five senses. Yeah, trying to explain something that exists.
yeah, so we'll go to the next point. So Kant basically says existence is not a predicate. So one quick refutation of it would be being is evidently not a real predicate and cannot be part of the concept of something. He proposes that existence is not a predicate or quality. This is because existence does not add to the essence of a being, but merely indicates its occurrence in reality. And so in the previous argument, when we talk about it, like what's going on is the greatest possible being, they're including existence in its greatness, right? Because it can be in the mind and in reality. But that's a confusion of concept and object. Concepts are in the mind. And to know an object is for it to be in reality. And so it would be a category mistake from the ontological argument to stipulate that existence is part of the concept. That's why it's begging the question, because that's what you're trying to prove. You're trying to prove its existence.
So the results prove its existence, like not the action itself or the idea itself.
Okay.
Like radiation, for example, like radiation itself, you can't see, you can't taste it, you can't smell it. You don't know it exists until you have the effects of its existence on you.
Sure.
Or like with X-rays or stuff from like
So that's a cosmological argument. We went through that with Aquinas.
that's cosmological. Okay.
Right? So if you talk about causality and you say we see the effects, like the cosmos exists, and therefore there must be a first cause or an unmoved mover, and we're going to call that God. You can say it's God. I can call the cup squishy, right? You can put any term there and say that's what we're going to call it. But for that thing to have the properties of the other thing, squishy actually means like a flying entity that can pass through walls. If you start saying that kind of stuff, you have to demonstrate that, right? And so if the first cause is God, then what do you mean by God, right? And then really what's going on is the car salesman is showing you this really fabulous thing, and then later on you get this ticket and you're like, hey, I didn't know all these extra charges were there, right? So you need to be explicit about what you mean by God if you're going to associate it as the Big Bang or the beginning of time or whatever it is, the first cause, unmoved mover, right? But it's not the case.
But let me ask you this,
Yep.
I mean, this all sounds very persuasive. But why, in human histories, many more people than people like you will believe in God? Why
Yeah.
is that?
It's because it's psychologically useful in some ways. And the example from psychologists is called terror management theory. So we go back to like the first slide. We talk about epistemology, terror management theory, or a belief in a just world. And the mechanism, we talk about faith, is a belief without evidence. It's not actually knowledge. It's a different category. I should move it over here. And the way that they come to that belief is through socialization and indoctrination, right? And dogmatic thinking. And people separate the idea of God like kids do with Santa Claus. If the kid's like, oh, that's my puppy dog, it does these things. And then you say, what about Santa Claus? Can the puppy dog do what Santa Claus can do? Maybe there's some magical thinking to some degree, but eventually the child realizes that no, the dog has a limited spectrum of behavior. Whereas Santa Claus has this other magical thing. And then eventually the kid gets over it. But for God and religion, the salesman to the religion, right? Whether it's a priest or a rabbi or whoever, they say, hey, you know, if you suffer, do you suffer at all? You say, well, yeah, I suffered today. Like, I have the solution to all of your suffering and everyone else, you know, all of their suffering. So well, what's that? That sounds like a great deal. That's like saying, I have this car that will magically take you anywhere, anytime, instantly. Like, okay. And it's free. Okay. Right? You get this thing called the afterlife, where there is no suffering. And it's for eternity. And all of the greatest things you've ever experienced in this life, you will get that beyond your imagination in the afterlife. And you're like, wow, that sounds great. I'd love to do that. Right? But it's not real. It's a product of a certain psychological and socio-cultural mechanism that has been useful to help us survive in most likely really difficult situations. Or if someone's grieving like the loss of a child or a loved one, right? You say they're in a better place. And then that can help you feel a little bit better, right? But it's not actually something that you can go and say, you know, it's just right over there, right? And there's a place where you can go. Like if someone travels to another country, you can still call them. There's no faith needed. You say, oh, hey, how's it going? Pretty good. Okay, cool. And you have the phone, right? So there is an explanation for why it exists. It's just a different thing than it's what it's claiming to say, right? So let's just go over here for a sec. We'll go back to where we were. So Kant, and then so now this is the last part. So what do we talk? So what is God then, right? So what's the Achilles justice answer to this thing? We've gotten this far. I didn't cover everything, but I covered like some of the main arguments
Throughout history.
Throughout history. And so this is what I say. There is some representation of God that most people will have in their minds. This can be, for example, expressed through specific religious perspectives, right? So a Christian would experience it their way, a Muslim would experience it their way, a Jew would experience it their way. If you're Hindu, you could experience it in your own way, right? So, but what would a representation of God as a psychological phenomena be if we remove these religious explanations and personal, perceptual, hallucinatory experiences?
What is a hallucinatory?
So if people, like when I told you there was that person that I knew, that they said they experienced God, and God was so big, its eyeball was as big as the sun. So big God was for this person, right? Some people have experiences, like I said, we can induce spiritual experiences, or people that have near-death experiences will experience God in some ways. Sometimes they'll report that. Or the God helmet that was used at McGill University to induce a religious experience for nuns, for example.
Oh, I know that. That's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
So if we take away the narrative to that is mapped on there, what would be left? And so I would call this the God self. It's a self model that individuals have, and it can be represented sometimes as self-talk, the voice in your head. Sometimes there may be a voice in your head that some people would interpret as God speaking to them. But it's really just you talking to yourself. It's just that it's a specific mode of self-talk. That's one. It's not, when I say God, it's just, it's a different kind of part of you. It's not something that's all powerful. Like when we go all the way back to the beginning, we say, what are the attributes? It's not these. It's different. It's a different definition of what we mean by God. But if we were going to look at how can we explain this phenomena, right? And this is something that you could actually measure in some ways if we set up the right conditions for that. So another way that I communicate it is the meta self. So there are moments of self, and then there are process selves, like my critical thinking self, we could say, right? But then there's like the meta self. It's the self of the selves, the form of myself, or the category of self. And so in self theory, or in set theory, there are some categories that include the set itself. So the set of sets.
Hmm.
So the set of all things, the set of all sets includes itself as a set. And so that is kind of like what we mean when we talk about the God self. It is, if there are momentary senses of self-expression, it is the grander thing that connects together all of the other selves. And what people do is that the mistake is when, like, I'm trying to strip away all of the socio-cultural elements of it and just look at what the thing really would be as the form. So represented in form, not in content. Because some people might have the religious experience where God tells them to like kill people, for example. And so you would say, well, how does that make sense, right? That it would be in some way, in some form of self-talk, right? Or some way that the person interpreted some action through a personal experience. And then they thought this was the way to go, some moral, thing that we would, from an external perspective, say that's not the right way. Or in Islam, when Hamas kills people, right? Innocent people that they perceive as violating Allah's rules or whatever, you know what I mean? And so they're justified to kill them, to have mercy on them, even though their women will get raped in this process. So I don't see how mercy is involved in that, right? And so this is the last slide. So God is not a religious force or even spiritual in the way that spirituality is used, but it is a force of the mind.
How is spirituality used?
As like a mystical or non-physical entity, like ghosts or like the Holy Spirit. Within the cosmos, all of the inanimate objects and matter, humans have the most advanced consciousness that we know of, right? Relative to inanimate matter and other organisms, we are a God. If you look at the molecules or the atoms in my hand and in... One sec. Let me just finish this slide, then you can go. The mouse can't move on its own. It'll just come back on, I think. Or is that just this one room?
What's going on?
Sometimes they just turn off the lights.
Yeah, it happened before.
Oh,
And
they're not
so-
closing, are they?
My capacity for volition or autonomous control is an attribute of godliness. When you compare living organisms to all of the other forms of matter in the cosmos, right? When we look at the difference, the change, right? The scale is much different for me as a moving animate thing than rocks, and then you could talk about plants, then you could talk about other animals, and there's like a spectrum of how matter organizes and moves itself, right? So the God within us is not one of the properties defined historically, but representative to our place within the cosmos and its self-model function in our mind.
One second, the last one.
So
Yeah,
you say that humans have the most advanced consciousness,
that we're aware of.
That
There
we're
may be
aware of.
more advanced, yeah.
but what if within humans, would you agree to the point that some have higher states of consciousness compared to other people?
Sure, but you got to be careful if you start saying that they're gods and other people are not.
No, not
That's
saying
not the
they're
way I'm
gods or
trying
not. No, not
I don't
I'm
wanna
not
say that.
taking it that way. I'm just saying, like, if there's like a certain spectrum of consciousness,
Mhm.
who is there to say consciousness stops at
Let there be light.
a certain
Couple
point?
seconds, be light.
Sounds uncon.
Me though, because I would have had to like say it on time and actually be in control. Okay.
But hold on. So with all this,
Okay.
what about spirituality? What's that?
Well, spirituality is, so again, like spirit is a synonymous word for mind. But people, like out of like the witchcraft kind of era or whatever, or like spirits and demons, have this like ghostly interpretation of what spirit really is.
Like operations.
Yeah, but it's not that. It's the mind. And you could say that that is who you are. That's that is the root of your identity, of your individuality as a person is the way your mind is, and your godliness is within that, right? So this is like, I'm blaspheming here to some religious believers, but that's the point.
But,
I see a lot of people in our society with no brain, so I don't know how that's possible.
Well, we can talk about that. Sorry.
But where's the mind? In which part of your brain?
Yeah, so the mind is a supervenient phenomena of the brain.
Supervenient, what does it mean?
So supervenient is there are properties that emerge out of that are more complex that emerge out of simpler properties. And the mind is not in like it's not like a physical entity, and that's where you can get like Descartes' dualism, for example, right? We're not trying to look for the place of mind in that way. We just need to understand the mind relative to the brain. And we know that there's a relationship between these two because if someone gets brain damage, like Phoenix Gage, for example, it's like the classic case in psychology. He had like a railway thing go through his head and then he just changes the person. People have brain damage, they change as individuals, right? And their mind is affected, right? The mind or soul is not indestructible. It just isn't. And people change.
You mean it is destructible?
It is destructible, right? If you get hit in the head, your prefrontal cortex gets damaged, you're not going to be the same person. Right?
Okay, so if it is destructible, is that a free will?
Well, okay, we can talk about free will.
Or those people that got hit by lightning and because of that, their brain healed so that it was like more connected
Okay.
and then it became geniuses.
I don't know about this, but
There's
okay.
a bunch of those people
All right.
that it's happened to. They got like hit by lightning or they had a really bad head injury.
Okay.
It acted.
And when the brain healed and the head healed, the brain had more connections in the head.
Usually when there's like when there's impacts to the brain, it like damages the brain and there's no going
Well,
back.
I've seen like some a documentary about it.
Okay, we could look at that.
Probably some like anomalies. Almost like
Well, these
anomalies.
people like this one guy got beaten up with like a bat and stuff, like just like mugged.
Mhm.
And then when he healed, he had this like he was like a genius on the piano and with math. Like there's a number of these stories with people.
I'm a little skeptical. We'd want to take a look at it and just check
Yeah,
it.
there's a number of stories.
Because there's a lot of examples of people, usually what happens if you get hit in the head, like if you have concussion, like there's irreversible brain damage.
Yeah.
Thing is, if we can, if those people are actually studied, like
Right.
scientifically, like
Yeah,
with
sure.
MRIs and like the EEGs. So like if you can study those people that have gone through that experience and have healed in a certain way to see what is so different from their brain versus someone else's, like how theirs healed. So maybe through like maybe shocking it or something
Yeah.
through like a certain to achieve
Maybe.
the same result. I mean, like it has to be through trial and error, and of course it's unethical. But when you die, your brain stays active for a little bit after, right? Or once the heart stops, the brain is like
There's like, I think there might be some activity, but you know, like we could look at some, there's a recent study that was done in 2022, I think, about someone that died in an fMRI machine and they got to see how the activity, it's going to be close to a near-death experience. There's lots of people that, like lots, but there's a significant sample of individuals that have had a near-death experience and they report similar findings.
that's what I mean. Like if someone were to die, their heart were to stop, and they'd be like, I guess clinically, I hate using that. I guess that's my word today. Clinically, if they're clinically reported dead, how are they able to experience whatever they experience after they have passed if the brain has no blood? They say like once blood stops from the brain, that's it. Like
Yeah,
done.
well, part of it is that there's like,
it's like the spirit of experiencing it. I don't even believe in the spirit, but what would be experiencing that?
well, just it's like if you turn off the car from the ignition, it's going to take a little bit of time for the engine for the pistons to stop firing. It's hard for the naked eye to kind of see that maybe because it's so quick. But you know, there's people like report on near-death experiences, and I think Susan Blackmore is the person that writes about this. But it's usually a deprivation of oxygen that creates those experiences, right? So, yeah. So those are some of the arguments. So this was a response to Judge's presentation because I wanted to do a review of what they have said God is.
But you forgot I think there's one more concept. You remember the watch on the forest?
Okay.
That's an argument. I don't know who have that.
It's the intelligent design argument.
Yeah.
So again, like that argument doesn't make sense. Like if you were just on the beach, if you're just walking down the beach and you saw a watch, and if you see the watch, that necessitates a watchmaker, right? And they make certain arguments that like the eye is such a complicated system, it couldn't have evolved on its own, but it's not the case. Like if there is an instance of a thing that exists, you can't just stipulate, like I said, with the first mover situation, that it is this God. Because even if it is an intelligent creator, it could very well be an alien. It doesn't have to be the Christian God. Like, who said that? Right? So you, like, to prove it logically, you have to, the conclusion has to be supported by the premises. Right?
To make a valid argument.
For it to be a valid argument. And so that's why when I talk about epistemologically, we can know things through reason, we can know things through experience, right? And then faith is a different thing. It's not knowledge.
What
It's
tuition starts burn something then.
yeah, well, sure, but
Intuition.
intuition is
Weird
again,
one.
why is it the case that some people have this God intuition, but other people don't?
I feel like everyone has intuition. Just gotta learn how to use
I
it.
think that for me, thinking about like what people would think about God, I think everyone has a different view.
Or like the perception of God, you mean? Or
Yeah, like even if they all went to the same church, say, even
Yeah.
like I think even that group of people would have a bit different views on God. I mean, they'd have the basic rules, I guess they were all indoctrinated with, but
Yeah.
like the way they see God is probably in each other, like their minds is probably different. That's probably a bit of a different view.
Even the way that we perceive color
I
or
agree.
how we experience music, you know, or you could even have people that play the same Mozart piece, but they'll all play it a little differently. The way that they play, how they hit the
Yeah,
keys
yeah.
and like subtle little,
I was like on YouTube, there's one guy who says he said he doesn't believe in God, but he believes in karma.
Hmm.
And I wanted to ask you what you thought.
yeah, it's the belief in the just world, right? And so like, what is the, like one question I ask, well, I do wanted to point about the last thing, we'll talk about that before we go. One thing is, what is the causal mechanism of karma, right? Like you can talk about it as a principle, but when you look at the cosmos, or even just in nature, like that bird that I found on the ground today, right? Like that bird, that sucks for that. It fell pretty far and it was all right. It was still alive. It didn't look like it was seriously injured. I found this bird on the ground.
Yeah.
Little small baby bird. And so where's the karma for the bird? You know? And when karma, part of that is the assumption of reincarnation, that if you're a good person, you'll come back as like a higher ordered being. If you look at all of the beings, like all of the insects, like the billions of insects, was every insect a person? Because there hasn't been enough people to account for all the insects.
You talking about past life stuff?
Yeah.
so is it only like
Some people
few?
say if you're a human, you're always a human.
So you
can't
could
be
talk
like
about that, yeah.
an animal. I've heard that, but I don't know.
I think
Fundamentally-
I don't know anything. I know Buddhism they believe in reincarnation, right?
I think there's a sociological ripple effect that, or a social ripple effect of being a good person, that other people will model similar behavior. Like there is something going on there with human beings that could be kind of a kind of scientific way to talk about karma.
I agree. I think there's a scientific basis to karma in a way, in certain respects.
But people,
Like I could
Yeah.
talk about it. Like I could, but my like understanding, like if you're constantly doing like shifty things, right?
Mhm.
Who are you going to gravitate around, right? It's like, what kind of people are you going to gravitate to? If you're a shifty person, you're probably other shifty people, right? Like,
sure,
and then like you're going to get in more and more trouble. You know what I mean? Like,
But it's
you're
not
gonna
karma
attract
per
these
se,
things
yeah.
to yourself. So yeah, I don't know.
it's more of a lifestyle thing and probability.
Mhm.
Like going back to the categorical imperative, if you lie to people, eventually it will have negative effects in your social life,
Mhm.
right? Because
Mhm.
certain people will know about it and it will reflect on your character. People won't trust you.
Yeah.
But karma as a thing is like there's this like cosmic scale of good and bad.
Mm.
And we would see did all those people in
There was this Buddhist story. There's a story where some woman, somebody died in her family, or there was some like really bad event, or she was really ill or something like this. And then all these Buddhists and she was part of this Buddhist sect group. And they were, I don't know if it was how cultish it was. It might have been more on the cultish side.
Sure.
But they were saying that, oh, it was because of your past life, you did something bad.
Yeah, that's
Do you know
not,
what I mean? And yeah, that's kind of silly, right? Like
it's garbage talk. It's,
it is.
you don't want to, Like it's a belief in a just world, right? And then trying to say that
Well,
good
and that
things
your
happen to
past,
good
like-
people.
Yeah.
And so when a bad thing happens to a good person, the only way to say is, well, maybe you had different lives where you were a bad person and you're paying for it now.
Yeah.
But why does the present person have to pay for the past people? What's the purpose of dying then? Right? Like,
Yeah.
how does it like, you know,
I
why
agree.
didn't you just punish the past life and that life? Because if it's cosmological, like if it's God power, you could just be hit by lightning right now. Like literally the concrete underneath your feet could just open up and you could fall like 40 feet down. We're on the 8th floor, however, 80 feet down, you know?
Mhm.
Like, why does it have to wait an entire cycle with a new fresh start? Like conceptually doesn't make sense,
I
right?
agree.
There might be a perception of a good or a bad event happening.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, right?
Like in the moment, it might seem bad, yeah. But like, what if that one event has a positive outcome in the near future? Makes you more patient or more stronger or more, I don't know, something positive out of that negative experience that we would consider a bad experience.
A lot of times what happens is that certain information in your experience is more salient.
Salient or salient?
It stands out,
Oh.
right? And so there are a whole bunch of things that occur that are just neutral. You just don't even pay attention to it as you're walking by. But then when something bad happens, our minds fixate on that so that we can improve the quality of our life and survivability to prevent its occurrence from happening again. Let's just talk about really quick. I'm just going to go back to sharing the screen and just re-explain this last point.
Before you do that, I want to add something to the previous
Uh-huh.
one. How you say we only focus on the bad things that happen. I believe that's from a lack of gratitude too. Because there's a lot of like good things that happen.
Yeah,
every day.
exactly.
Like having a room available today, we just completely took it for granted. And
Sure.
Subconsciously accepted it. Now, if there was no room available, like, oh, that was such a bad thing. Like, you can view it in that sense.
Exactly.
So I believe it's just a lack of gratitude or the acknowledgement of something positive. That takes
Well, it's your orientation towards things. Are you more pessimistic or optimistic, for example, right? And optimistic, I'm including gratitude as like a property. Okay, so you wanted me to clarify this. So God within us is not one of the properties defined historically, or does not have those properties of omniscience, omnipotence, all powerful, right? But representative to our place within the cosmos. So that's the
She said we're done.
discussion about how our agency and consciousness is disproportionate to inanimate objects and other beings. That's the first thing. And then the self-model function in the mind, that meta self-model function.
explain that first part again.
So us, we're most advanced. So if we met aliens, they would be gods to us in some ways,
Uh-huh.
right? So we are our own gods, and the dog is its own god, which basically just means that you have some degree of self-control and agency.
Like authority, kind of.
You can make decisions and do stuff. You can choose to do things, and that is your godliness. Your agency is a property of being a god, and you can be good or bad, right? You can hurt people, or you can be pro-social and bring things together. How people experience God is going to be directed by the schema of God, all of the ideas that are connected to that, which is usually done through the socialization / indoctrination of their religious group, right? So some experiences may stand out more like, oh, God is speaking to me, or God did this, God that, right? But I'm trying to like strip all that stuff away and look at what distinguishes you as a being in the cosmos. And there are certain things, right? And within you, where would we find this kind of a property? It would be in the self model, and it would be a specific kind of self model.
What about those, maybe, what about those, the near-death experiences?
Yeah. So people, like, if they have like a low oxygen in their brain when they're dying, then they like see this tunnel and like a white light, and sometimes they'll experience like someone speaking to them, right? And yeah, that's just like a standard thing that may be representative of like the birth canal, and the brain is trying to make sense of the disorientation neurologically, and then you just experience it that way. It's kind of like a dream, right?
Okay.
There's like a cognitive explanation for why we experience dreams in the way we do, and it's because it's just a perceptual or experiential representation of your brain sorting through information, and then you just have this narrative sometimes that you may remember, right?
So can I just, can I just go a little bit back to the free will?
Okay, sure.
The free will?
Yeah.
So if your mind is destructible,
Yeah,
you just said that, right? The mind is destructible.
yes.
Does that mean that free will doesn't exist? Because free means, you're not depending on anything.
Well, the mind is something that, like, your state of mind fluctuates. Like when you're tired, right, you may not be as attentive. Then after you've had some coffee, and attention or your ability to focus on information is a faculty of the mind.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's not a static state, it's a dynamic state.
Mhm.
And that dynamicity can be reduced.
Mhm.
Right? The degree of how dynamic it is can fluctuate. That's why I talk about cognitive capacity.
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
some people's minds will be very depreciated if their
Mhm.
working memory isn't functioning.
Mhm.
Like in the case of FESD,
Mhm.
they it's like when I'm speaking, they only hear like every third word.
Mhm.
So things just don't make sense to them.
Mhm.
You talk to them,
Mhm.
and that means that abstract concepts, they're not going to comprehend them.
Mhm.
Right? Because you need to put together language and then systematize it, and then you understand information.
Mhm. Mhm.
Also, they have a problem with like the comprehension of time and managing money,
Mhm.
moral things like you talk about, like inappropriate sexual behavior, all that kind of stuff,
Mhm.
right? And so, yeah,
So you mean that cognitive is dependable? That means it's conditional.
It's cool up there.
So there's no free will.
it's not that there's no free will. So I take the position of soft determinism, that in the moments of deliberation, that's when your free will is at its peak. But very often you will have preordained responses to things. And determinism in the sense that it's different than like fate or destiny. That like there is a way that the cosmos is functioning, but from our perspective, we're at the cusp of the present moment. We're in the now, right? And there's this multiplicity of things occurring, and you're interacting with the environment as time is going on, and you're making decisions. And so you can premeditate ways of doing things so that if you are on a fixed behavioral pattern, you will do that behavioral pattern as a response in the moment. If you don't have moments of deliberation. But to deliberate, to think and calm the mind down and be aware of what's going on increases your capacity for quote unquote free will. But there is always some factors that are influencing how you're behaving and acting. Because what do you mean by free will? Are you just like a floating, like, are you not human? Are you a floating entity?
Brought up.
That's one of those things, right?
I'm saying, if you like Hitler once said something like that. If you bring me a bunch of kids, I could just train whatever I want them to be. So that's no free will. It's everything is hope. It's from.
We have until 10:30, right?
Sorry,
We have until 10:30.
according to,
The library guys downstairs.
no, the building's closed, 10 o'clock, unfortunately. I'm gonna need you guys to pack up and make your way out.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.